My name is Olivia Foster. I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Ontario Woodlot Association, and thank you for joining us today. Today is day 3 of Woodlands Appreciation Week, and today's daily focus is about species diversity. And we're very happy to have Tom Hilditch join us for today's talk. I'm especially excited about today's webinar as my own educational background is in ecology. And I think Tom is going to layer in a lot of stuff about his experience with the woodlot as well. Now, before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items. First and foremost, we have a Q&A box up and running, as I see a couple people have made good use of already. Throughout the presentation today, feel free to enter in questions that you may have. Anything that is particularly time sensitive, we might just pause the presentation and Tom can answer the question. Otherwise, we'll wait until the end for the other questions. And you're also welcome to upvote questions that you would like to hear that you would like to hear answered. And you're welcome to comment as well. We also have the chat box below. And we'll wrap things up shortly after 1 p.m. today. Now with that, I'll introduce Tom. So Tom Hilditch is the chair of the Ontario Biodiversity Council, and he's also the founder and president of Coluscent Environmental Inc. During his 42-year career as an ecologist, Tom has completed environmental projects in Canada, China, Barbados, Venezuela, and Equatorial Guinea. He currently serves as chair of the Ontario Biodiversity Council, the chair of the Committee on the Status of Species at Risk in Ontario, CASERO, and he serves on the board of directors of the Anishinaabeg/Ontario Fisheries Resource Centre. Tom is a speaker and an author. His first book is Becoming an Enlightened Consultant Awakened by Cancer. Thank you, Tom, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking some time out of your day. With that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Olivia. That was very kind of you. And yeah, I think I'll offer a couple more comments about my love of woodlands, if I might do that too. I'll start my slides up here, and I've done a lot of environmental consulting for 40 plus years. I started as a self-taught naturalist. I grew up in the Humber River system in Toronto, and I was out there. I was a strange high school student. I spent all my time in nature memorizing Latin names of plants and animals. So I learned a lot about the natural systems that we get a chance to explore and enjoy as I was younger. My first job was actually as a forest technician with, at the time, South Lake Simcoe Conservation Authority, now Lake Simcoe Regional Conservation Authority. So I've got a background in forestry to some extent, and I live on the valley of 12 Mile Creek in St. Catharines. So my property extends down through the forest to the river here to 12 Mile Creek. So I've actually been spending the last few years removing invasives in the forested slopes into my neighbors' yards as well, and propagating and growing native species. So I've been doing quite a bit of work on my own lands related to conservation and biodiversity.
Tom, I'm not able to see your slides right now. Do you have your presentation shared?
Yeah, it is, and I'm not able to move the slides, so I'm seeing.
Oh, there we go. I'm able to see it now on my screen.
Are you able to move the slides, Olivia? It's not allowing me to move them.
I am not.
That's interesting.
Maybe if you try sharing it again. Or maybe on the bottom corner there, the bottom left-hand slide. I'm not sure if you'd be able to forward it that way.
There we go. Thank you. That was very helpful. And so I spent a lot of time. I know a lot about some really unusual woodlands in Ontario. I've had the ability to. I've studied probably 10 or 15,000 acres. Don't know how many hectares that is of woodland during my career, and some very unusual ones. So I've had a chance to get an understanding of very different systems. But I wanted to thank Olivia and John, the executive director, and Paul Robertson, who is the representative for OWA on the Ontario Biodiversity Council. I chair the Biodiversity Council. I was elected into that role late last year. And there's been a team led by Steve Hounsel and by the Secretariat at MNRF who have been working on the renewed biodiversity strategy, this State of Ontario Biodiversity Report. And that huge effort is coming to a conclusion. We're days away from releasing the updated or renewed strategy. So we're very close to launching a report that's going to guide conservation in terms of what the members of OBC do until about 2030. And including OWA, there are about 45 members of the Ontario Biodiversity Council. So I'd encourage you, when you have a moment, and you'll see the announcement about the release of the strategy, when you have a moment, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. I'll be touching on some of that today and sharing comments and ideas that I think are particularly relevant to your organization. And the last point on this slide is something that I've been feeling for quite a while. I've done this for a while, 40 some odd years, but I do feel a sense of urgency, like I haven't before, about nature and about our ability to protect the resources and nature that we depend upon. I think we're at a point where we need to accelerate action. And it's interesting because the work on the renewed biodiversity strategy, the strategy is virtually done. And now we have to translate that into action. So I'll be talking about some of that today. And just before I do, the book you mentioned, Olivia, that I wrote, that's part of my sense of urgency, I think. Like I grew an environmental consulting company to about 40 people, sold it to an engineering firm. And shortly thereafter, I was diagnosed with cancer. And during awake brain surgery, which is a fascinating experience because I was awake while they were operating, they were asking me questions to make sure they weren't messing with the function of my brain. And I swear my brain's sharper now than it was before cancer. So it's a real gift to have had that cancer. And it went into remission. The doctors and my focus on every day being a spa day at the hospital got it into remission in 4 months, which is about 8 months ahead of when they thought it was possible. So I feel like I've got a renewed sense of my purpose here and what I'm trying to do. So stepping in to chair the Ontario Biodiversity Council is a wonderful opportunity for me to accelerate things I can do positively myself and encourage groups like yours to build on the work you're already doing that is magnificent and to do it faster. My presentation today, and I'll target to present till about 1:45 or so. So we have lots of time for discussion at the end, but as Olivia said, don't hesitate to post questions. Olivia is going to monitor them, and don't hesitate to interrupt me. But there are 5 components I thought I would address today. One is leadership, which I think OWA is really well positioned in. And then I'll talk about biodiversity and species at risk. In the biodiversity piece, I'll talk a little bit about the renewed strategy and about the global biodiversity framework that was developed and launched last year in Montreal, the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Climate resilience, we can't talk about biodiversity without also talking about climate change and the ability to have climate resilience in the woodlands that you're managing and looking after and stewarding. And then the last 2 pieces, a path forward. I do believe all of us now, we need to be thinking with more of a sense of urgency, but also a mind towards producing more meaningful outcomes wherever we can. And I've got some suggestions and ideas that might be interesting to you. And some of those relate to transformative actions, because I think we are in a transforming world right now. It's a strange world in that we're facing sort of the twin crises of biodiversity and climate change. At the same time, we're facing geopolitical instability globally, war. COVID is finally pretty much behind us, they say, but we've been through a lot as a civilization, as communities, as woodlot owners over the last few years. And I think that that's part of a transformation. And I think there are things we can do collectively that'll make that transformation easier. So those are the 5 things that I'm going to talk about today. And leadership, I really only have one slide on it, apart from a couple of pictures, because this time of year, when the spring beauties come out in the woodlands, I notice things in the spring. Spring beauties, these are slender-leaved spring beauties. This is from a site in the middle of the Detroit River off the shore of Amherstburg on the border of the US. And it's actually a really disturbed location. And yet the spring beauties came up again this year. Despite the degree of disturbance, you can see a dandelion on the left-hand side of the screen. But nature comes back through disturbance, and there's a certain resilience that we find in nature that's encouraging. So when I think of leadership and I think of the spring, I think about leaders renew themselves in the spring. You folks, when I look at your website after the first line, I see sustainable and productive, ecologically healthy and diverse, spiritually and physically renewing. Those are your visions, the mission statements or vision statements that you have on your website, which I think are really interesting. They're very broad. They're not sort of one discipline oriented. It's not to produce as much wood products and associated materials as possible in a year while doing it sustainably. You've got in here ecologically healthy and diverse, biodiversity and resilience, and you've got spiritually and physically renewing. And I was telling Olivia and John before the session started, part of my recovery from cancer, because I'm on this forested valley in St. Catharines, I spent a lot of time out there in the woods when I was less energetic in recovering from cancer. And I think the woodland helped me an awful lot. So I really do see the spirituality. Olivia.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I just wanted to jump in as I've seen that someone has raised their hand. We'll just give that individual a second. I have allowed you to talk if you want to ask your question. We'll just pause for a moment.
Yeah.
Maybe it was by accident. Perhaps we'll continue, but if that individual wants to pop a question into the Q&A, go right ahead. We can continue on.
Thank you. I'll keep my hand on you, Olivia. That was a great wave. You caught my attention. Thank you. As I looked at your website and I understand a little bit about what you've done with OBC, with the Biodiversity Council, I also offer that you are forward-thinking and patient. Anybody who depends on trees and growth of trees has to be a patient individual. I think you're inspiring because of the work you're doing. You really are allowing these woodlands to be more productive while appreciating them. And your members, I expect, are very much grounded in nature. And I don't think you are afraid to think differently about things. Like your focus is on woodlands, although when you focus on woodlands, you also talk about wetlands and wildlife. So I think you're probably unafraid to think differently. And these are my speculations. But I think thinking differently is really important. And it reminds me of a book from 1960 by Dr. Seuss, One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, which my parents read to me because I'm old. And that was a book when I was a kid. But I didn't realize until I started to participate in the Ontario Biodiversity Council that book is about diversity. And it's about the importance of respecting diversity and understanding everybody's different. Everybody has different values, different interests that come from different cultures. So it was fascinating to me that I was reminded by a kid's book about the importance of diversity and the importance of recognizing we can be different and we can have different intentions and values in what we do. So a little bit on biodiversity and SAR, species at risk, challenges and opportunities. This is one of my favorite plants. I don't know if anybody recognizes it, but it's a woodland plant. It's quite rare in Ontario. It's called golden seal, and it's collected. It's like ginseng. It's collected for medicinal purposes and for the value of the plant material. But every now and then I'll offer a comment about a particular plant I like. I talked about the last few years being difficult. The markets have changed and continue to change. The markets that you participate in have changed. Even the value of real estate in some places has changed more dramatically than we thought as urban people move into the country to work from home, to work remotely. But in terms of the woodlands that we're in, we're seeing range shifts in plants and wildlife. And we're seeing the phenology or the timing of nature, when things arrive, when species arrive, when different trees bud, when plants appear. There are shifts, subtle shifts, and I'm seeing them because I've been able to study nature really closely for a long time. I can tell that we've shifted 10 days in both directions, in the spring and the fall in some places. So part of that means, how do you manage a woodland if you're counting on pollination and the pollinators and the flowering aren't coincident or are disconnected now? So there are some challenges that are a little more subtle that we don't necessarily see as easily. The ones we see are the ongoing invasive species threats. Buckthorn and garlic mustard, in terms of the woodlands I spend a lot of time in Southern Ontario, south of the Canadian Shield, those species are quite aggressive and quite dominant. And there are people like the Invasive Species Council are doing really good work educating us about how do you control these species. So if you're dealing with those challenges, there's an opportunity for you to learn from and collaborate with groups like the Invasive Species Centre in Ontario. We're also seeing, we've seen, butternut get hammered. We've seen ash get hit by the emerald ash borer. There's talk about, people say that eDNA for the oak wilt fungus has already been found in Ontario. There's no conclusive proof yet that oak wilt fungus is here, but the oaks will be under pressure. Beech trees are under pressure from the beech bark disease. So we're seeing these things in your own woodlands and in nature generally. And in some regards, we push nature pretty far and to the brink in many places. I think of some of the woodlands that I'm looking at now that lost the ash canopy. They're down to oaks, silver maple, Norway maple. So we're seeing a reorganization of some composition in response to climate change. And we're also seeing unfriendly plants like giant hogweed, which can be very toxic if you happen to touch it, appearing. And I'll mention that towards the end as well. In terms of the opportunities, it's not all negative, and I tend to be a fairly persistently optimistic person, regardless of what's happening in life or around me, because I do think we've got this. We can turn the corner and make things a lot better. I wasn't at the COP15 meeting. I was at the World Biodiversity Summit that was sort of next door to it. It was a private sector and philanthropic element of COP15. And out of that, many of you probably have seen the headline, at least, that we have a global biodiversity framework. And I found the words early in that document interesting. Like that framework is meant to catalyze, enable, galvanize urgent and transformative actions. And it made me think of the Ontario government's Build More Homes Faster Act that came out a while ago. There's never been a time to build more forests faster. And I think we do need more homes, and we need more affordable homes. And I was at a meeting in my community last night about homeless people in St. Catharines. And the problem is really scaling up in terms of affordable housing. But I'm intrigued that the global biodiversity framework used words like that, because it is urgent. I'm fascinated by one of the things I listened to carefully is the 30 by 30. 30% of all of, in Ontario's context, our updated biodiversity report is looking for achieving 30% of terrestrial and aquatic systems being conserved and restored and linked together by 2030. So that's 7 years away. To achieve those kinds of targets in Ontario and nationally and globally under the biodiversity framework globally, we've got a lot to do. There's a lot of habitat creation, reforestation, afforestation, and enhancement to be done. And that translates into more action on the ground. One of the things that we're in the early stages of talking about is holding a summit. The Ontario Biodiversity Council holds summits periodically to pull people together, to share ideas, to showcase work that's going on. And we were targeting late in the fall, but I think we're going to shift that now into March, April of next year to give us probably 10 or 11 months to pull that activity together. Ontario Woodlot Association, I think, could be an important part of that summit in terms of bringing knowledge to the table and demonstrating how you're doing the work you're doing so that other people will follow you. And the other thing I learned about frameworks, especially the global ones, is you can get lost in acronyms. There are a lot of acronyms, and reading some of that stuff, it's very thick and dense material to read. And I've read it, but I'm still left with certain basic impressions, like we need to do this faster. We need to fix what isn't working well. So there are opportunities. When you see the materials that the Ontario Biodiversity Council release over the next couple of weeks, it'll be presented in a way that'll be easy to consume, easy to understand, but I just thought I'd point out a couple of things to you so you have an opportunity to think about it. I mentioned, one of the targets, enhancing resilience. I didn't mention it by name, but you can see the 30% target right there. So this comes from the Global Biodiversity Framework, where all of the countries that signed it, which is most of the countries on the planet, have agreed to hit that target of 30% marine, freshwater, terrestrial habitat conservation by 2030. So it's an enormous task globally. We have to look at ourselves here in Ontario and think about our local settings and our individual woodlands. But that 30 by 30 is it's entrenched globally, and now it's going to be entrenched in the provincial documents. So we need to think about how we're going to get there. There are people in the Ontario Biodiversity Council who are very wise and giving advice about how do we fund this? Where's the money going to come from to hit some of these targets? And how do we transform investments? Because we can't do things the same way we've done them over the last 10 or 20 years and expect to hit these targets. We do need to be different. There are other targets about empowering people, reducing threats, improving knowledge. Indigenous people are instrumental and fundamental in terms of the work that's got to get done over the next while. And we can talk about some of the examples of that as we get into this. But we've got sort of 15 minutes or 15, 20 minutes that I'll walk through the rest of the slides, so I make sure I'm conscious of the time here. Just as a couple of examples where we're trying to get to actions. What are the priority actions that people need to think about? And picking one, for example, generating and sharing knowledge. I don't know whether OWA is a storehouse of information, whether you, beyond sort of the hectareage or the acreage that you manage and individuals manage and collectively manage, are you monitoring your woodlands for other indicators, for water levels in wetlands, for amphibian population abundance? Are they still there? The population's going down at all? Are some of the species that are on your lands and in your woodlands still there? Even butternut, are the butternut surviving? Are the trees, butternut trees that are successfully beating the blight and are able to, or the fungus, and are able to stay there and continue to reproduce? I'm working with clients, two projects that I find fascinating. One of them, Shumard's Oak, again down in Essex County, where this client, a land developer, is collecting acorns, Shumard acorns, and using a local nursery to produce Shumard seedlings, because that species isn't very widespread. Another client I work with has lands in the Burlington area. They have American chestnut, viable American chestnut that are fruiting. So there's the Ontario Chestnut Councils that we're interacting with. So as people become more aware of the opportunities and the groups out there that are already doing work, that information will be important. So I'd encourage your organization to be thinking about what you're monitoring, what you're keeping information on, whether there's a level of community science in your group that might be harnessed differently. And you can monitor really any of these elements like invasives and temperatures in woodlands. I used to do studies of the humidity in woodlands and the temperatures and shading effects of different species and edges, and look at how useful those things are to predict where area sensitive species might be, bird species, amphibian species. So there's a lot, you have access to a lot of natural information. And that's the kind of discussion OWA and other groups should have. Should OWA have a biodiversity plan? Or do you have a biodiversity plan? How would your members contribute to a plan like that? All of these things are pieces that groups are going to begin to talk about, and will be encouraging at the council level, and talking with the members about how we begin to help each other and harness the information so we do better more quickly. Just a couple of comments on species at risk in Ontario. Olivia mentioned I chair CASERO. I chaired SARPAC, which the sister committee to CASERO, Species at Risk Program Advisory Committee, that helped advise the minister on implementing the act. I chair CASERO. I've chaired, between those two, I've chaired for 12 or 13 years on those different committees. So I've learned a lot about how we decide what's significant in Ontario, what label we give them, and all of the Ontario work. It really depends on that middle upper box. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, has a red list. That red list has a series of criteria that our federal government, the counterpart to CASERO at the federal government, CSIWIC, Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, we all use the same criteria. They've been modified. In the top right, the Act in Ontario was amended in 2019. There's some modifications to criteria, but we have some fairly standard criteria, so we know what's significant. Your members, I expect, are across most of the ecozones in the province, maybe not the most northern. And I imagine a lot of you are in the Ontario Shield and Mixed Wood Plains. So from a species at risk perspective, CASERO, we read all the information. We know how many individuals are out there of different species, where they occur in Ontario. We apply the criteria. We say, is it what level of significance? For example, is it endangered? And this is top to bottom. You don't see extinct or extirpated, but highest level, they're endangered on their way out, threatened on their way to becoming endangered, special concern on the way to becoming threatened. So the two I skipped over, data deficient if we don't know enough, and not at risk. Theoretically, Ontario, we want to be not listing as many at the top and delisting or downlisting, moving them down. Ontario Woodlot managers and owners have an opportunity there. You know, there are species that aren't listed yet, because you see the 230 number there. There's about 230 species listed in Ontario as at risk. We've got about 20,000 species in Ontario. So we know that 230 isn't a full suite of the species that are at risk. It's really a function of how fast does CASERO do their work? How fast is CSIWIC listing? How often do we look at our own Ontario species? So there are limitations that tell me there are a lot more species at risk that just aren't listed yet. And you might find, for anybody who knows plants in a woodland, some of the more mature deciduous forests, for example, you might find ginseng, you might find Canada waterleaf, species that tend to need more mature, heavier forest cover. And those are the kinds of species. Indian cucumber root, it's not the right word to be using, Indian cucumber root, that's the common name of it. Mediola, I think, is the genus. But if you're seeing species in your woodlot that are a little different, you don't see them that often. There's no reason why, with some guidance and some support, you can't be increasing the numbers on your own property, increasing the numbers of Canada waterleaf if you have populations of those. And some of what I talk about at the end of this presentation opens the door to woodlot owners and managers being more active in ecological restoration, which is one of the biggest markets and challenges we have facing us in Ontario right now. So I've talked about a little bit. We know that Kasiwik, the federal group, just listed 3 more bat species as at risk federally. So Ontario will be looking at those 3 species as well. So we'll know what Ontario decides with respect to bats, but more might be listed soon. And I've mentioned your role in sort of harvesting science and collecting it. Groups like Casero depend on existing information to make decisions. So if the information that all your members have actually got into the systems, even generically or to the extent you feel comfortable, we would be much better able to actually have the best science to decide, is something really significant, or we just haven't reported it. So those are a couple of things on the species at risk side that might be helpful. In terms of climate resilience, this is an interesting pond. One of the more unusual ones, it was a ice pond that back in probably the late 1800s, somebody used to dig down. They created a pond. They used to chop ice out of it, saw ice out of it, and drag it to the house. It's now habitat for Jefferson salamander, species at risk in Ontario, and this is a breeding pool for that species. So many of you as members have these pools. You have vernal pools that dry up sooner. You have permanent pools. In these pools, you can sometimes have quite unusual species. This is quite unusual, and there aren't that many locations for it. But there's an importance attached to really understanding what's on your property and the potential value of what's there. It reminds me of a project I did with a First Nation group, Henvey Inlet First Nation, north of Parry Sound and south of Sudbury, where they were building, in partnership with a private company from the States, they were building a 300 megawatt wind farm, which is built and operational now. I remember talking to Chief McQuabi because he had so many ponds on what we call their reserve lands, Indian reserve lands, another name that should be let go of at some point. But I was commenting to him how many species at risk they had, turtles in particular. Like they had incredible concentrations of threatened and endangered turtles. And I said, why is that? Is it because you're not using the land as much? And he said, no, it's beaver pelt prices. He said in the 1910s, 1920s, they used to hunt all the beaver. Historically, they hunt beaver, and the beaver were off the landscape. So all the streams were flowing, the water was moving, there weren't many ponds, but then the pelt prices dropped and they stopped trapping beavers. And all these ponds filled up and the dams got built, and the beavers created habitat for this incredible concentration of rare reptiles at risk. So it's interesting that the indigenous wisdom, the knowledge that can come from people who have lived on the landscape for thousands of years, versus somebody who's gone out to study a site for 2 summers. The combining of knowledge and wisdom can be very insightful and helpful. But knowing what's on your land, I think, is the point I really wanted to make here in terms of having water nearby. With climate change, there's a sense of urgency, and I feel a sense of hope. And it's funny because I was thinking you are a group that sees the forest and the trees. You see the bigger picture and you see the smaller picture, and you're stewards. But the risks are becoming more intense, like droughts and wildfire. We're seeing wildfire out west in particular right now. And for the last few years, I couldn't help but think that it's not going to be too long before we start to see larger wildfires in southern Ontario. The province issued a wildfire guide manual, sort of best practice manual, a few years ago. And I was surprised looking at it because they ranked different types of woodlands and forests for susceptibility to wildfire in southern Ontario. And we're familiar with like the Henvey Inlet site north of Parry Sound. There was a large fire there not too long ago. Periodically, there are fires, especially in camping areas, cottage areas, largely able to be controlled. But I think we're going to see wildfire become a more prominent risk, which means where's the water that you're going to use to safeguard your woodlands or fire breaks? What are the things you're going to do to manage the droughts and the wildfire? The more intense storms, we're seeing a lot more wind damage. I'm sure some of your members are seeing that. And disease spread, invasive species. And I talk at the end about awareness, because I think you have a really important role to continue to play in terms of helping people understand the importance of the resources that you steward. So, some of the even projects in the most southern part of Ontario now that I'm working on, we're talking about where's the water going to come from to put out fires in urban, near urban, rural landscapes, southern Ontario. Some of the limestone quarry operators who might have tried to pump dry quarry bottoms and turn them into playing fields and other things, they're in active discussions with the municipalities in some places about, could that quarry be a source of water that could be conveyed to protect our forests and protect our communities? And fire breaks, I haven't seen a lot of fire breaks these days, but you folks are experts in this. You probably have all of this as part of your normal operating approach. There is some growing interest in Indigenous fire stewardship, and some people call them cultural burning. And Indigenous people during periods of time would intentionally burn certain areas to get rid of the debris. What do you call it now? The fuel. Get rid of the fuel and the amount of fuel. Manage the amount of fuel in a woodland so that you're managing the risk. Solutions on the ground could be really different too. Assisted migration. I'll show a couple of pictures, but I'm coming across sassafras that's spreading a little further to the north than historically it's been. And you folks use the word ecoforestry quite a bit, and I'll talk about that in a moment too. But it's time maybe to think about what other products could we generate on the ground that could allow us to deal with stress, like removing fuel, but also allow us to increase revenues and diversify revenues. And tulip tree. I'm seeing a lot more tulip trees up in the Burlington North area. This is sassafras. This is in my backyard in Niagara. But I know there's sassafras populations doing really well around the Burlington into Oakville area. And they seem to be quite vigorous and healthy. And then there's some interesting companies out there. I think this is called Beam. I apologize, I'm gonna have to look it up, but they're on Manitoulin Island. They're using some of the salvaged materials differently. And Indigenous people who are working in this company are actually creating paints from native plant materials, and they're using the paints in a unique way on a variety of different materials to produce products that are interesting. And I love the products on your website. There's some really different things happening out there as people begin to explore different purposes. And that's my favorite plant, Panax quinquefolia, ginseng. So the path forward, I'll finish with a couple of slides on the path forward. And I think meaningful outcomes have become top of mind for me. When I work on projects, I'm a private consultant, a one-person private consultant. Most of the work I do over the 40 years has been with the private sector. So I'll work with people who are building things. And I'm finding some of my clients now are saying, and some of their websites are saying, we want to be into sustainable development. Tell us what that means. I've got one client who said, our board is asking us, what are we doing to conserve biodiversity? And this is a very large national development company. So they're getting these kinds of questions from the boardroom now. So they have to begin to think about, how can what we do be more meaningful? And there's a lot I could share about examples there, but the first point, be keenly aware of your, and I expect most, if not all of you, are very keenly aware of what's on your property. I'm sure you know because you manage it. I think we need to be thinking about resilience more seriously. What is that going to mean? Is it time to start removing and replacing cultural pine plantations more rapidly? Is it time for a different, more integrated, diverse forest management approach versus cultural plantations? And I imagine that's what most of you are doing anyway. But I do think it's time to think and act differently. I come up with some strange ideas sometimes, and one of 10 of them seems to have legs, and some people appreciate it. But, you know, I'm thinking like you folks, everybody's talking about needing positive news. You could share a lot of news about the importance of what you're doing and the benefits that you're accruing for people, even so far as becoming a guardian of the resources. But the last slide is maybe a bit different. Is it time for, and I've got this Beatles song, Revolution, running through my head because I'm older, but is it time for a treevolution? Is it time to think differently about some of the work that you folks are doing and others are doing? Like, I think of the wine route that runs through Niagara and Prince Edward County, and whether there is a woodland route or a woodlot route, certainly there's a significant interest, especially in urban communities, for better well-being. People are needing to feel connected with forests, and there's a whole group developed called that deals with forest bathing, people going out and just experiencing, not naked, but just experiencing nature and understanding, and, you know, allowing their blood pressure to go down, allowing their heart rate to change, using the forest for emotional well-being. So I think about that, and I wonder over time whether your members or some of your members have thought about collectively creating trails or routes, like, you know, sort of an ecotourism approach to it, where you might attract people who are very interested in forests, not necessarily for some of the products that come out of it, probably as well, but for different reasons. And there's a boom, and I think this started from COVID, in foraging, people going out and foraging for wild plants. It used to be just mushrooms, and leeks, wild leeks, which are out in the woodlands right now, but there's a push right now for people to be out foraging. There are Facebook groups that I've looked at that they're all wondering, where do we go to get this species? And with the increasing population in Ontario, with COVID, with more people working from home, that pressure on the foraging is going to grow. So whether there are some economic opportunities for woodlot owners and managers to collectively or individually find ways to attract attention and generate different revenue streams. The biggest piece that I thought I would talk for a couple of minutes about and leave you with, and then we can have some discussion. When you look at that 30 by 30%, just speaking about the land for now, 30% of all the land needs to be in natural vegetation. It needs to be in forest cover or naturally vegetated by 2030. I don't know what the numbers are for Ontario, Southern Ontario wide, but you can find those numbers by county, by region. Some of the lower tier municipalities have those numbers. So we know where there's more forest, where there's less forest. But if we really want to meet these targets, it means we have a lot of forest to create and a lot of habitat to build. So building more forests faster, building more habitat faster. We can't satisfy the demand right now to provide the materials that will do that. There are a couple of reports that just came out of the US, seed sources. They're saying, you know, native seed sources, that they're not producing enough commercially, and there isn't enough capacity down there and enough people on the ground collecting seed to be able to satisfy the needs in their country. And I think we're seeing the same thing here. There are a number of people who have spoken at your events who are possibly members, but commercial nurseries are doing their best to grow native species. Some of them specialize in it, like St. William's Forest and Ecology Center. They have a lot of native materials they produce, but it's not available retail, only wholesale. So this rewilding market that's emerging, it's been emerging for years. People have been doing ecological restoration work, rewilding work for years, but that market in front of us right now is massive. So whether, for example, individual woodland owners, or whether OWA wants to have a biodiversity plan, a seed source management plan, whether you want to take that and embrace that market opportunity differently and think differently about it, because you own a lot of land and you manage a lot of land, and sustainably and in a coordinated fashion, you could probably pick the top 20 species that people are really interested in buying, perhaps even creating an OWA native tree nursery or some facility that you can collaborate with that you become the people who actually harvest the seeds in your woodlands and figure out the best way to make that a model for you financially, but also at the same time contributing to meeting the global biodiversity framework targets and the Ontario targets. So and I do this, like I spent some time learning all this myself and buying all these books about seed harvesting and germination, and I did all sorts of experiments in my yard. I have a native garden. So I learned a lot about what seeds like and what they don't like. So there's wisdom out there with different people, and some people don't like to give away the locations of where they get seeds, but you have all of the seeds. You have this from a tree perspective. We lost the provincial tree nurseries. So maybe this is an opportunity for your organization to think a little differently, maybe partner with others. Carolinian Canada was just down in Washington presenting their work on Save Ontario Seed Strategy, I think is what they call it. Now, they're not necessarily focused on trees, but they might be a logical partner for you. I know some commercial people who are interested in it. This is probably the biggest market I've seen in a long time. And we're just seeing the tip of it. So there's an idea here that you might find interesting. So that's taken us to the last 10 minutes. I think that was my last slide. Yes, that was my last slide. So Olivia, maybe I'll pause there and see if there are any questions, and I can stop sharing.
Sure, Tom, thanks. That was excellent. So many different topics that you touched on, and it certainly engaged a lot of questions in the chat. I think I'll just take this time just to jump in, as there's already quite a few questions in here, and we'll just start with the first one. So someone has asked, Tom, what has been your experience with municipalities and conservation authorities who have incorporated natural heritage components into their official plans that identify significant woodlands? But when it comes time for severances, etc., where these woodlands should have a scoped environmental study done prior to severance, they are giving in to property owners or other political pressure, and either ignoring the condition or allowing a self-assessment with quotes around it, with no ground truthing or verification by CA or any other agency. So what has been your experience with this?
Oh my goodness, that's a huge question. Thank you. And I have several comments and opinions. So let me just think through to answer the question most directly. Municipalities are generally caught up with the 2010 Natural Heritage Reference Manual, which is a standard that exists out there right now that tells people, how do you decide what's significant? So the standard has been there for 13 years now. Most municipalities have adopted it. Most municipalities are putting natural heritage systems into their official plans because they're mandated to. My experience when it comes to testing those, some municipalities have done no ground truthing or very little ground truthing. It's more of a two-dimensional exercise, people drawing lines around maps and saying this is a significant feature, includes mostly woodland, it's got all these other pieces. So if they haven't done a lot of detail at an upper tier or even at a lower tier municipal scale to define those limits, you're bound to have people testing the edges and testing the boundaries. And that's what private sector people sometimes do. They'll come in and say, well, we've done more work on it, and this is our opinion. So there's a challenge with natural heritage in that I think we need to update the manual that tells us how to decide what's significant, because when you have criteria that make everything significant, it makes it harder for individuals to deal with that. In my mind, every woodland is important. Every woodland's got important functions. It's got characteristics that everybody should value, but that doesn't mean they're all significant. So a municipality, I think all municipalities would probably be well off to pause right now. Look at the Ontario Biodiversity Report, which calls for improving municipal approaches to natural heritage and biodiversity conservation, and see if we can do it better. See if there are any adjustments to standards we need. See if municipalities have to be more transparent about how they do this work. Make sure if there's anybody trying to do a severance or a development of any kind, they have to do the technical work to prove what's there and what's not there. So it's part of that too, is just thinking about as an environmental consultant, for example, I don't have any professional standards that I meet, like an architect does, an engineer, a landscape architect, a surveyor. They all have legislation and standards. There's no professional accreditation for a biologist in Ontario. So you'll get a range of different experience levels and capabilities. So there's if I'm thinking natural heritage, I'd also say people like me need to have certain level of certification and accreditation so that the work that's done is trustworthy, whether it's for a municipality or for somebody else. So it's a big question and a lot of moving parts in it. But I think the challenge is really what's on the ground. And if we start with the assumption everything's important, a municipality is the one who has to decide what's significant and has to stay and go. And they may decide that a proponent or somebody with a severance deserves to have a severance. So it's sort of site specific, but it's not a simple situation to deal with.
Complicated for sure. A lot of factors going into that and things to consider. Thanks for that, Tom. We have another question that's kind of getting at the solutions on the ground that you had been talking about. And there were certainly a lot of OWA members along the Kawarthas and into the east that experienced a lot of that derecho damage last year, nearly a year ago. And someone has asked here, wind damage among the pines in our forest. Is a wildlife-friendly brush pile a sounder wildfire prevention option than letting the debris lie flat?
Excellent question. I'm not a certified fire manager. I listened to a presentation at the Federation of Ontario Cottagers Association meeting a couple of months ago, and there was a fire specialist there from the province talking exactly about that and talking about all the ice storm damage and the wind damage that happened and what to do with the debris. Their general comment was, if you leave it all lying on the ground, it's fuel and it's going to exacerbate future risk. So if you're talking about creating wildlife brush piles, I think it's an excellent idea. So then it would be, you might want to pay attention to cleaning up some of the debris and the fuel elsewhere and concentrate some wildlife piles to benefit the wildlife because they're smaller, they're more contained, and perhaps they could be put in a place closer to water, closer to a wetland, on bare rock or closer to bare rock where the risk would be reduced.
Thank you. Yeah, that would be an interesting, perhaps future webinar for us to bring in a fire specialist to talk about that in more detail. We have another question about species at risk. Someone was wondering if there's a map to show distribution of species at risk, but it's a very sensitive topic. Is there anything that this person could look at?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you're right. There's sensitivity around mapping species at risk, especially some of them. There are species at risk, and then there are sensitive species as well that nobody talks about or maps because they're collected by people aggressively. So there's different levels of that. For species at risk, like Casero, for example, when we assess a species, somebody's done a status report on the species. They include maps in the status report saying generally where the species occurs. Sometimes those maps will be pretty high resolution if the species is more sensitive. If it's not as sensitive, they might be clearer resolution. So I would, if I had a particular species in mind, I'd search the status report, then I'd search the recovery strategy, then I'd search the government response statement. Those three documents provide some insights into the geography, usually by township or usually by broad circles. But you're right, that's done intentionally so people can't go out and cause more harm.
And if someone were to find a species at risk on their property that hasn't been reported, where would they go to report about that species?
MNRF has something called NHIC, Natural Heritage Information Center, and that's the repository for information about species. So they're the gatekeepers for all of the information. So if you're finding a bunch of landing turtles and you don't think they've probably been reported from a particular area, that would be useful information to submit to the NHIC. And I think they have some standard submission approaches on their website. There's, the province, when you deal with species at risk, the province it all used to be dealt with by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry. Then through the government reorganization, MECP, Ministry of Environment, Conservation, Parks, got reorganized, and they take carriage for most of the species at risk, or almost all of the Endangered Species Act for materials. So you would typically go to MECP if you have questions about endangered species. But if you're wanting to give information, the NHIC is still housed under MNRF, and that would be the recipient organization.
Excellent, thank you. We have a couple more questions here, but if you're okay for time, Tom, we'll continue on. And if anyone else is unable to stay with us past 1 o'clock, we should have the recording up on YouTube. We've got a couple more questions in here. Sure. Another one that we have is, based on your experience, Tom, are there any species of trees from the Carolinian forest areas that you would recommend for planting in areas further north?
And that's a great question again, and it's a question that is influenced by soils and microclimate, soil types, soil moisture. So there are certain species that would do well in certain areas. A couple of species I find fascinating are black gum and sycamore, pin oak, swamp white oak. Those species are already, I think, moving to some extent. Others, like Shumard oak, have a very limited range, and it would be great to see more propagation of Shumard oak down in Essex and in the southwest to promote the density and the population sizes. But those are ones I would look for. But Carolinian Canada is a really interesting organization. Michelle Cantor runs that organization. They've worked for years on the Carolinian zone, and they've got some webinars about collecting seed and how to plant a Carolinian species. I've bought pawpaw trees from them, and I have pawpaw trees growing in my yard because that's a really interesting tree. And they have an annual pawpaw parade. So I think anybody interested in Carolinian trees might want to take a look at their website.
Great. Yeah, they do a lot of really great work. I had a comment come in about the last question about species at risk. And someone said, if you have a cell phone, just take a photo of the species at risk and upload it to iNaturalist. It's an easy app to download on your phone or even use on the web. I mean, you don't even need to identify the species, as the app is pretty good at giving suggestions for identifications. And of course, there's experts as well who can follow up on that. I have one here that's specific to ash trees. Someone has dozens of ash trees growing on their woodlot. How could this generation of new ash trees be protected?
I think the jury's still out on that. I don't know that, we're much further ahead with butternut, where we're producing canker-resistant butternuts grafted on walnuts. I'm not sure that we've advanced to the point where we understand the cyclical nature of emerald ash borer and whether it's going to perpetuate itself like Dutch elm disease does. So I think it's probably early to say. There's a lot of interest. Like there are different ash species. Blue ash down in the southwest is quite an interesting species if somebody wanted to propagate a species that's much less common. Black ash, there's a lot of interest in black ash. It was going to be listed by the province. The province is doing a special study on it, as I recall. But black ash, there might be different levels of resistance from one species to another in ash, so that might be worth considering as well. Perhaps there's some diversifying of an ash population that might be helpful over time.
Yeah, there's a lot of ongoing work and definitely a lot to learn there with ash trees and a lot of other species as well. Someone was asking just a little bit of a pivot question. There are so many great charities out there. And is the way of knowing, is the way of knowing which one is to donate? Sorry, I'm just having a hard time reading it. Yeah. Is the way of knowing which charity to donate to based on how much they are concerned with the environment, or perhaps how would someone decide which charity they should donate to?
Wow. Really, really interesting question. And the same questions posed by people: what stock do I invest in? Do I want somebody who's heavily invested in oil or hydrocarbons, or do I want somebody who's paying more attention to the environment? And sometimes that information isn't very easy to find. When you look at the NGO world in Ontario, environmental non-governmental source organizations, you've got some really prominent players who have long-standing reputations for doing really positive work, like Carolinian Canada, for example, Nature Conservancy of Canada. There's probably 100 of them. You know, Ontario Nature is an umbrella group of a lot of local naturalist clubs. So I think part of it would be, if you have some background knowledge of those, I give money to Ontario Nature, Nature Canada, Nature Conservancy of Canada, Royal Ontario Museum, Carolinian Canada, because I recognize, me personally, I see the work they do as being important. But there are so many. You'd have to do a bit of research into who you prefer and what kind of things you want to make a difference with. Then there's a whole side of the social community side and homelessness and Indigenous peoples. There's no end to the number of people who need support and assistance and encouragement. But on the environmental side, there are a few big ones that are certainly doing good work.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We had a comment shortly after, or just before you had finished the talk, actually, someone saying that they appreciated your thoughts. They particularly liked how you mentioned a tree evolution. They said that they get their zen in the forest and spend as much time out there as they can. And they had mentioned that they had found a tick today, and perhaps that's something that we can do more education on as the Ontario Woodlot Association, as ticks are becoming more prevalent further up north these days. And we just have a couple more questions here, Tom. So one was asking, to deal with the inevitable heat and drying, should we be planting certain species such as black maple, black walnut, hickory, black locust in regions? And the region mentioned here was Whitewater region.
The black locust isn't native to Ontario. It can certainly handle drought and dry, sandy soils, infertile soils, and it helps build up the soils. I picture black maple being more in a mesic sort of moist situation. So my personal experience would suggest black maple isn't maybe the best. Walnuts tends to be, they do really well in ravines, valleys, valley walls. They do well on the tablelands as well. Part of the solution here is how can we irrigate? How can we minimize risk to the trees that are there? We could make a shift. Hickories, I think, would be a good choice. Oaks would be a good choice. The oak wilt's coming. So I would tend to think of oaks and hickories for perhaps more drought tolerance, but I would also at the same time be thinking, what capacity is our well on our property? What could we do? Do we need another well? Do we need a communal well to protect large forest system that's in our area? I'd start to think about some of those innovations, because I think we're going to need to be prepared.
We also had a comment in from Sylvia again that you may want to look into what your local land trust is doing in acquiring properties in your area. Ontario has dozens of land trusts operating through much of the province. So that could be a source of looking into perhaps recommendations for tree species, as well as conservation authorities have lists up as well. I think we will leave it at that at this point for the questions, Tom. Thank you again very much for your time. I have one last slide to show. And it's a bit of a thank you. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. We're going to be sending you a book called Around the World in 80 Trees. It's become a bit of a favorite of ours here at the OWA. So we'll get that to you soon.
That's very kind of you, Olivia. Thank you for this opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
We're really glad that you could join us here today, and we appreciate all of the information and the questions that you've taken. Up here, I just have a little bit more information about Woodlands Appreciation Week. It'll be continuing until this Saturday, and you can follow along on our social media channels just at the bottom of the screen. There's also a question about our YouTube channel, and you can see that there. You can just type in Ontario Woodlot Association into YouTube, and it should come right up there for you. So thank you again, Tom. This was wonderful, and perhaps we can do it again in the future.
Thank you, Olivia. I appreciate it. You take care.